before we play some video games, we can look at the new talents because patch is supposed to be tomorrow, right? So we have our new Moonkin tree. They reworked, well, the Druid tree as well. They reworked the Druid tree and they reworked the Moonkin tree. The reason why it was reworked was mainly because of Solar Beam, I believe. And there was also some other issues that people had with the tree, and then they just reworked it, which I think is good. So now Solar Beam is gonna be basically a must-have if you want Starfall, which some people have complained about. Some people basically said, oh, I don't like it that I'm forced to take Solar Beam now. Because they didn't like the fact that it was a damage loss to take it before, and now they don't like the fact that they have to take it just because they want Starfall. Which, I do understand their point of view. There are definitely some fights where Solar Beam is useless, right? For sure. There's definitely some fights where you do not need to interrupt anything. Or in fact, there isn't anything to interrupt at all. So it feels like you're wasting a point into Solar Beam just to get to Starfall. Now, the reason why I personally don't mind that at all is that by having Solar Beam as like a mandatory talent point almost, you never like feel bad for taking it if you need it. Like, I'd rather have Solar Beam be like something you always take or you have to always take, rather than it being like an optional thing that is a damage loss to take though. Because even if the damage loss is smaller than it was previously, so let's say you could take a different talent here instead of Solar Beam, even if it was just like a small damage gain, people would still maybe feel bad for taking the Solar Beam instead, you know? So that's why having a mandatory Solar Beam will never make you feel this way. This way, it just feels like, oh, we just have Solar Beam all the time, right? But as soon as you are in a situation where it's like an optional talent and another talent that you could take instead gives you a damage increase, it would feel like, it does feel a little bit bad. Even if it's only 0.1% of damage that you lose for taking it, it feels like, maybe I don't need Solar Beam here, you know, like maybe I can go without it, get this 0.1% damage increase, you know? So I think it's okay that it's here. But that said, there definitely are builds that you can do without Solar Beam the next patch, but only like pure single target, because you don't have Starfall. Right, so if there's a fight where you really do not need Starfall at all, like there's only one target and one target only, like Taros, then you wouldn't have to go with Solar Beam. And then you also don't go with Starfall, and you also don't go with Ethereal Kindling, and so on. Whenever you need Starfall, you're gonna have Solar Beam. And I think it's good. I like it. Some people also argued that, oh, it will be a damage loss because now we have to spend a point into Solar Beam that we didn't have to do before. So people are basically arguing that before the patch, we put all of our points into damage abilities, and after the patch, we put 1 point into Solar Beam, resulting in a damage loss, which I do understand your thought process, but keep in mind that Blizzard always balances the class according to people's skill. Like, it's not that Blizzard looks at each individual talent and balances the talents. They look at the whole talent tree as a whole, see how much damage your class does, and then balance that. Let's imagine, for some reason, that half of our talent tree, our spec tree, would be utility. That gives us 0 damage. Does that mean that we would do less damage than other classes? Not as a given, right? Just because other people spend 30 points into damage abilities, it doesn't mean that we do less damage than them because we only have 10 points that we spent into damage abilities. Because Blizzard in the end can balance everything however they want. They can give this talent a 5% damage increase for you. This is a 10% damage increase. This is a 20% damage increase, you know, like they can do whatever they want. So it's not like this is going to be a damage loss just because we have Solar Beam. That is just not true. All right, so that's the thing about Solar Beam. Then let's look about the tree otherwise. So the tree, in my opinion, is pretty good. There are some weird things that I'm not like 100% happy about, but I think it's not like the worst thing in the world. So first of all, they removed Circle of Life and Death, and they replaced it with Cosmic Rapidity. But Cosmic Rapidity is just better than Circle of Life and Death. So basically, this makes your dots deal damage quicker, but they don't disappear faster. So that is going to be much, much better for Moonkins, because now your dots don't disappear instantly anymore because you have Circle of Life and Death. They're actually going to be up for longer. So even if you don't have Ethereal Kindling that elongates your dots whenever you Starfall, you will still have them up a little bit longer. Technically, it's a little bit of a mobility nerf though, which is something that people sometimes don't consider. So like on a pure single target fight, this means that you have to refresh your dots less often, which people think of as a good thing, and understand why, because it can be annoying to constantly refresh your dots, right? But it also nerfs our mobility on pure single target fights, because we have to cast our dots less often, and therefore we have less globals for movement, right? So there is technically a little bit of a mobility loss in like a perfect scenario, like a single target scenario or whatever. But outside of that, it should always be a time gain, like for AoE fights, especially if you don't have, if they're all kindling for whatever reason, if it's like a raid fight that doesn't have like a lot of AoE, but like an AoE once in a while, then it's really nice that your dots don't fall off super fast. I think that is really nice. All right, outside of that, they did rework a little bit of stuff with Umbral and like generally our Eclipse. So basically they buffed our splash damage with Starfire. They want Starfire to be more of a thing in our AoE rotation, I assume at least, because in the previous patch, we didn't cast Starfire that much at all. We were just like constantly dotting, constantly starfalling, casting mushrooms, casting stellar flare, you know, doing all of these things and not really starfiring because it wasn't really that much of a damage gain and you would rather just do other things. So now they changed some talents and changed Eclipse and changed our Starfire a little bit to make sure we're casting more Starfires and to increase our splash damage of Starfire, which I guess is good for some people because some people really didn't like this whole dotting playstyle, whatever. I personally don't like it because I think it makes us, well, I don't just think, it's a fact that it makes us less mobile. The more important Starfire is, the less mobile we're gonna be, because for Starfire, we have to stand still and cast it. And we do not have Stellar Drift anymore like we had in the previous expansions, where we could just run around while casting Starfire. We don't have that anymore. So I personally don't necessarily like the fact that they're putting more importance onto Starfire, because I don't think, in an Plus situation, I don't think it's a good thing that you have to cast more Starfires. I just don't think it's gonna be that nice. But there's gonna be different talent builds that you can now go that will basically determine your playstyle a bit more. So for example, if you want to spam Starfire and you want your Starfire to be a really big contributor to your overall DPS, which probably is going to be what most people do, then there's some talents you can go that increase your Starfire damage. And if you don't necessarily want to do that, if you don't want your Starfire to be such a big hitting thing, then you just don't go with those talents that buff your Starfire, right? So you definitely have a little bit of options, I feel like, at least for now. I guess once the patch comes out and people play around with the talents a bit more, I assume that there's going to be one build that everyone's going to be playing in the end again. But yeah, for now, we only have the theory crafting numbers. We don't necessarily have a like best in slot build for either single target or AoE or hybrid fights. Because, yeah, we have the numbers, we have the SimCraft numbers, but we don't really have people test these builds properly in like real scenarios. Because we all know sometimes the sim numbers give you a result. It's like, this is the best. But then in reality, it's not true, because it doesn't keep in mind movement, it doesn't keep in mind some like ads dying fast. There's just much fewer variables in a simulation than there is in actual like real M+ or whatever, or real raiding environments. I guess the other talents, they're all just the same, you know, like they got shuffled around. Like the tree looks very different, but it's not. Like it's just a lot of talents that have been shuffled. We now have Force of Nature and Warrior of Elune in like a choice node, which in my opinion is really nice. So everything just has been shuffled. There's also some talents that now have 1 point instead of 2, and there's some talents that have 2 points instead of 1. So that is something that they have to change a little bit, but outside of that, nothing too crazy. All right, so let's go to some builds. Recently, we also got a nerf, by the way. Well, it was a PTR nerf, so it wasn't like a live server nerf. But they nerfed Starfire because there were some preliminary sims that have been done for the patch, and Starfire seemed way too strong. It did so much more damage than Starfall that I think at some point it wasn't even worth to cast Starfall at all. Like you would just sit there and cast Starfire. Like overcapping Astral Power, basically, you know? Like just like sitting there, it's like Starfire, 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 you know? So I guess it's good they nerfed it because it was a bit ridiculous. So yeah, anyway, these are like the post-nerf sims, which means after the Starfire nerf. Let's take a look at single target first. So this is our live server sim right now, just so you have a comparison. And keep in mind, these sims are being made with best in slot gear, right? So you basically have everything that is best in slot in this profile, and we sim 79.8k DPS on a 5-minute patchwork fight, and just, you know, like normal full single target stuff. Keep in mind that the full single target sim also involves Convoke the Spirits and New Moon, which is something that in reality people don't play. So a real full single target sim is going to be a bit worse than this. This is like a full optimal single target build that people don't actually play. Like there's even Force of Nature here and stuff, for example. All right. Then this is live servers, and this is the patch sims that we have. So this is the first patch sim. This one is without Starfall, which, you know, like I don't think this is like a very realistic thing that people are gonna do unless you really just have like a pure single target fight like Taros, right? Like in Taros, you definitely do not need Starfall, right? Like you just don't. So I think this is this makes sense. So the reason why there's a point in Solar Beam is because you need to put an additional point here before you can go down, in case you're wondering, all right? So basically, with this sim, they picked up every single talent that gives them any sort of damage before they can go down, right? Now, of course, Twin Moons is also a useless talent, right? On a full single target build, Twin Moons does nothing. And Solar Beam also does nothing. So there's 2 points that basically are wasted. Technically speaking, you can put this Twin Moons point into Starfall as well if you would want to play Starweaver, you know? Because sometimes people want to play Starweaver in single target, so you could still do this build by removing Twin Moons and going Starfall, right? And then you can play Starweaver instead of Rattle here at the bottom. Because, again, Twin Moons obviously does nothing if there's only one target and one target only. Actually, wait, it does 10% more damage? Well, I mean, yes, technically does nothing, okay? Realistically, it does 10% more Moonfire damage, but yeah, I mean, Moonfire is, on a pure single target fight, Moonfire is very little damage. I guess I forgot about the fact that it does a little bit more damage from the Moonfire as well, but yeah, keep that in mind. If you want to play a Starweaver, you can do this. But yeah, Twin Moons is still a little bit of a damage increase on single target because of the Moonfire increase. But yeah, it's not a lot at all, so. Let's see, what else do we have here? All right, so we got the same talents as before. We still are Waning. Cosmic Rapidity is basically Circle of Life and Death. Then you're running Salt of Force and Nature's Grace like we did before. Running Pulsar like we did before. Power Goldrin like we did before. Rattle the Stars is the same. New Moon, keep in mind, New Moon again is being simmed on a full single target is always better. But in reality, as soon as you add movement and stuff, it's good. But the problem with New Moon is the fact that, especially when you have 4-piece bonus from the current tier, then you just have to cast so many things. Like, you constantly have to apply dots, you constantly have to use your instants, you constantly have to do this, you constantly have to do that. And then if you add movement on top of that, then casting New Moons is just taking away so much time that you maybe, like, you just have a hard time doing that, basically. Now, in a patchwork fight, in a simulation where you stand still, you can do it. But as soon as you add anything else, like movement, realistic scenarios, blah, 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 then New Moon just becomes much harder for barely any gain in comparison to Fury of Elune, and that's why most people just play Fury of Elune anyway, just because it's easier and because the damage difference is not like insane, right? You know, play Fury of Elune probably instead of New Moon. But at the same time, maybe New Moon is not going to be as bad anymore next patch because we don't have to refresh our dots as often anymore, because we don't have Circle of Life and Death anymore, and we're not playing Mushrooms anymore, at least on some of the single target builds. So it is technically possible that New Moon might be less annoying to play with in 10.0.5, and maybe it makes more sense to go with it then. But that's something we can try once the patch comes out, right? See if it's not that annoying anymore. Then we still play with Umbral, still Standard Firmament, Balance of All Things, Denizens of the Fae. Convoke, on pure single target, Convoke has always been better. We play Star-Lord. So yeah, pure single target talent build here without Starfall seems very similar to what we had before. No major changes. One thing that I want to know that people have been asking is, do we still enter Lunar Eclipse on single target? The answer is yes. Do we still cast Wrath in Lunar Eclipse? The answer is yes. Do we still use Starfire with our Umbral Embrace procs in Lunar Eclipse? The answer is yes. Alright? So from our single target rotation, nothing has changed outside of our talent choices and the things that we play around, but we still go Lunar Eclipse, we still cast Wrath in Lunar Eclipse, okay? So this is like one of the builds, right? This is just one of the sims. Keep in mind, all of these sims are... It's not a given that these sims are like set in stone, because these are PTR sims that of course are being made by our amazing Moonkin Theory crafters that are always doing an absolutely insane job keeping up the APLs and everything. But keep in mind that they also have a life and do things. So sometimes some of these APLs might not be like 100% optimized just yet, because I mean, it's not even on live servers yet, right? So just keep that in mind. So some of the numbers might not be accurate, or some of the talents might not be singing properly, or blah, blah, blah. They also said Boomy would be dead and unpleasant and recommended going feral. The Moonkin Theory crafters definitely did not do that. Unless you were asking about low and plus, and then the answer, then it is true. I mean, it is true. If you want to do plus 10 keys or whatever, you would be much better off going feral than play Moonkin. Even still to this day. Because yeah, Moonkin is really good on high and plus, but does that mean Moonkin is also good in low and plus? No, right? Can you explain why we use Starfire and Luna with Umbral? I'm wondering why, because Umbral... The reason why is because if you look at one single cast, like one single cast of Wrath versus a Starfire, it's just more damage with Starfire, right? The reason why you cast Wrath in Lunar Eclipse is not because it does more damage, right? It's because it gives you more Astral power, and the damage that you lose from not casting the Starfire is worth more, right? You always, whenever you think about casting Starfire versus Wrath, you don't only think about the damage, you also think about the Astral power it generates and how fast you can cast it, right? Because Wrath is a faster spell, and so yeah, Wrath, because it's faster, will generate more Astral power, but in comparison to Starfire, it will do less damage, right? But whenever you have an Umbral proc, you would want to cast a thing that does more damage, because I guess the extra damage that you get from casting the Starfire is more than what the extra Astral power generation will be from the Wrath. You know what I mean? It's just a math thing. And keep in mind that all of these things are very minor. Like, for example, casting Wrath on Lunar Eclipse is a very minor gain compared to casting Starfire. It's not that it's like an insane damage gain to do that, right? All of these things that we're talking about are really minor things. So if you cast Starfire in Lunar Eclipse, it's not like you do 10% less damage or whatever, right? If you want to cast Starfire in Lunar Eclipse because it feels weird to cast Wrath in Lunar Eclipse, you're gonna be totally fine. You still do fine damage, right? And if you use your Umbral procs accidentally on a Wrath instead of a Starfire, it's also not an insane damage loss, right? All of these things, like, it honestly, in the end, you can just think about it this way. It really doesn't matter what you cast. Like, if you are in Lunar Eclipse and you cast a Starfire on accident, you're fine. If you're in Lunar Eclipse, you get an Umbral proc and you cast a Wrath on accident, you're fine. You know, whatever you hit, you hit. You know, it's really whatever. But yeah, the reason why you cast Starfire with an Umbral proc is just because the extra damage that you get from casting a Starfire with it is outweighing the Astral power that you gain from casting a Wrath. But it's not doing that if it's not an Umbral proc, you know? So this is a full single target build that without Starfall. And keep in mind, if you look at the damage number, so this is 79,500 DPS, right? In comparison to our live sim, our absolute best live sim is 79,800 DPS. So it's a little tiny little bit of a single target nerf on a full single target build. Keep in mind as well, though, that this is playing with Convoke the Spirits, which you usually don't do. It's also playing with Force of Nature, it's playing with New Moon, blah, 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 right? Like, it's playing a bunch of stuff that you don't actually play. All right, then we have some different builds here, because this is obviously, this build here without Starfall is obviously not like a real build for like actual raid bosses. You're not gonna play this on any fight other than Taros. So here's another build. This one is with Starfall. Let's see. I guess that's the only difference. It has Starfall, that's it. Okay, this one literally just has Starfall and no Nature's Balance. It's interesting, by the way, because what I said earlier is wrong, right? Earlier I said if you want Starfall, you can drop Twin Moons. But apparently dropping Nature's Balance is better. So in case you want Starfall, I guess you would rather drop Nature's Balance. So Twin Moons is apparently a bigger damage gain on single target than Nature's Balance is. But yeah, so this one is 78.4. So it's a 600 damage loss to run Starfall rather than Nature's Balance. But it still has Convoke, which is unrealistic. Let's look at the non-convoke builds. This also has convoke. This also has do they all have convoke? Eh. I mean, we know that convoke is better, so it does make the sim convoke. It does make sense to sim it, I guess. Whatever, I can do my own sims afterwards to look at Incarn. This is with Starfall, then this is with, let me see. This is Star Weaver instead of Rattle, which seems to be 77.6k DPS. Yeah, it's only a 600 damage loss to not run Rattle. For some people, it's a damage gain though, so we'll see. Depends on your gear, I guess. Let's see, what's this last build here? This is with Kindling and Starweaver. And this is 77.3. Yeah, it makes sense. Like, all of these talent builds, the pure single target ones, though, you're basically playing the same thing. The main difference, I think, between these talents and our old talents is the fact that we're gonna be less mobile. Like, that's the main thing, right? Because we don't refresh our dots as often anymore. And we don't play mushrooms. So you have less globals. That's like the main difference that I can see between these builds. Other than that, nothing much changes really. You still do the same thing as before, kind of. People are comparing this number here to all the other builds. And then, yeah, it's obviously a damage loss. But this is also not like a realistic single target build that people are running, right? So you cannot compare this build to this build, right? Because in this build, you're running Ethereal Kindling, you're running Starfall, you're running Starweaver instead of Rattle, right? So you cannot necessarily look at this number here and then compare it to the 79k DPS. If you want to compare these builds, you would also want to run a similar build with the current talents, right? Alright, then we have some 4-target sims. I'd rather look at the 8-target sims, I think. Oh, here's the Lunar versus Solar comparison as well. Alright, so this is Enter Luna filled with Wrath. Here you can see the difference in them. You can see how tiny these differences are though, right? On single target, entering Solar Eclipse versus entering Lunar Eclipse if you fill with Wrath. Here you can see if you enter Lunar and you fill with Starfire, then that would be worse than entering Solar and filling with Wrath, right? So if you enter Lunar Eclipse on single target, then you should cast Wrath. Because if you enter Lunar Eclipse in single target and then cast Starfires, then that would be a damage loss over just entering Solar Eclipse, right? But yeah, entering Lunar and filling with Wrath is the best thing. But you can see the numbers are like it's all very small differences. Right, then we have enter Lunar, fill with Wrath, Wrath, Star, Embrace. This is with the Embrace procs. So this is enter Solar, and this is enter Lunar, fill with Wrath completely. And this is enter Lunar, fill with Wrath, and use Starfire on 2 or more 2-piece stacks. And this is enter Luna filled with Wrath and Starfire Embrace procs. So you can see that next patch we would still cast Starfire with 2 or more Embrace procs on single target. And we would cast Starfire with 2 or more 2-piece procs, sorry. And with Embrace procs we would also cast Starfires. This is for pure, with the pure single target build, you do this. Now if you run the Smolder builds in M+, then you would already cast Starfire on 2-piece stacks, not just 3, like we usually do, right? So it's a little bit of a change, but keep in mind it's not a tiny thing, right? And if you're running the Smolder and UI build, so Umbral, what is it called? Umbral Intensity, then you would actually want to enter Solar, which is interesting. So that means if you run, like depending on which M+ build you're running, you want to do different single target rotations. So yeah, if you run Smolder and Umbral Intensity, then technically you would want to enter Solar Eclipse instead of Lunar on single target. But you can also see that it's quite a lot of difference in damage here. Let's see, this is 70k single target DPS with the non-UI builds, and it's 68k with the UI builds, and 72k with single target builds. So decent single target damage loss with these talents. That is something that is pretty important, I think, but I'm going to talk about that a bit later. Starfall versus not Starfall with Weaver. What does that mean? Starfall Pulsar is the best Starfall pre-CA? Starfall 4-piece? Ah, this is always single target. Okay, so you don't want to Starfall pre-CA. You do not want to use Starfall for your 4-piece proc on single target. Okay, so yeah. So nothing changed for Starfall procs. So you still want to activate your Pulsar with Starfall like we always do. By the way, before they nerfed Starfall, because they nerfed Starfall a while ago. Before they nerfed Starfall, we would actually always use Starfall with our 4-piece bonus. no matter what. Like, even on single target, we would use Starfall. But after they nerfed Starfall, we actually cast Star Search with our 4-piece proc, right? And now that is still the case. So you still use Star Search with your 4-piece proc whenever you enter an Eclipse. And you don't Starfall pre-CA either. Alright, so that's all we have there. Then these are some dungeon sims. Now let's look at the 8-target sims. I like the 8-target sims. Alright, so this is the first bit. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the damage numbers first, just to get a feeling for this. Alright, so let's order them in like top to bottom, like this, right? So it's 430k, 427k, 414k, 402k, and 398k. Okay, so this is the damage in order. Okay, so this is apparently our biggest DPS build, which, keep in mind, this is always a simulation, so it might not be true, realistically. But yeah, so this is in a simulation on 8 targets. Let's see, on a 5-minute sim. The most DPS we could possibly do is with this build. Okay, so this has Starfall, of course, Ethereal Kindling, of course, and then it's playing with Smolder and Umbral Intensity. Smolder, in case you guys don't know what these talents do because we haven't played them in a while. Astral Smolder. Your critical strikes from Starfire and Wrath cause the target to languish for an additional 40% of your spell damage over 4 seconds. So it's just like a dot that stays behind. And Umbral Intensity makes Wrath do 20% more damage. And Lunar Eclipse increases the damage Starfire deals to nearby enemies by an additional 20%. So it just makes Starfire splash damage do more damage. So we're basically dropping Starweaver or Rattle. That's the biggest difference, and Mushrooms. So we're not playing Mushrooms, and we're not playing Rattle. I guess it's the biggest difference in this build in comparison to what we had before. Everything else still stays the same. So this build mainly focuses on casting Starfires, because we have a lot of things that buff Starfire here, right? We have Umbral Intensity to buff Starfire, we have Smolder to buff Starfire, we have 2 Umbral Embrace to buff Starfire. So a lot of like Starfire buffing stuff in there. It's basically just Starfire does a lot of damage in this one, okay? Then a little bit less damage, but not actually a lot. It's just like it's very little DPS loss to run this, which is basically, let me see the difference. So here you just run Mushrooms. You still don't run Rattle or Starweaver, but you put 2 points in Mushrooms, and you drop 1 point of Balance of All Things, and we drop 1 point of what exactly? Oh, it's Sundered, right? That you're dropping? Yeah. So you drop Sundered and Balance of All Things for Mushrooms. Like, this already seems more realistic to me, honestly. I personally think that in a 5-minute AoE sim, Mushrooms lose a lot of value because of waning, right? Like, I think on a 5-minute constant AoE sim, Mushrooms lose a lot of value because they're not providing Waning Twilight anymore. Because Stellar Flare is going to be up on all of those targets all the time because you're going to be applying it, right? And you have more than enough time to apply your Stellar Flares if you're just standing still. But in an M+ scenario, that is not the case. Like in an M+ scenario, you're not fighting the same mobs for 5 minutes. In an M+ scenario, you're keep pulling new packs, and you always have to apply your waning, so your Stellar Flare, as you go. So that's why I do think that in an M+ scenario, Mushrooms have more value than in a sim. And therefore, I think if you compare these two sims here, like this one and this one, I think this one is a much more realistic sim with Mushrooms. I don't think we want to drop Mushrooms. Even on a consistent 5-minute sim, it's only a 3k DPS loss. And keep in mind, 3k DPS seems like a lot, but not if you do 430k DPS, right? Like, that's not a lot of DPS in comparison. So anyway, I do think this is a more realistic build. Actually, this would be a bigger single target loss, though, I guess. Because on single target, Sundered Firmament and Balance of All Things is better than Mushrooms. So yeah, that's also something you have to consider. If you're playing this build, in my opinion, it's going to be more difficult to play in M+. I don't mean more difficult because of like the rotation is more difficult, but rather the fact that we have to cast more Starfires, which especially right now how M+ is in Dragonflight is going to be a bit annoying, right? Because there's so many swirlies where you have to move instantly and you can't just like finish your cast and then move. And there's just generally a lot of things you have to move with, right? You have to do line of sight, you have to do this, you have to do that. And with all of that movement involved, I think if a big portion of our damage is from Starfire, I think realistically, we're going to have a much harder time than we have now. But I think we don't necessarily even have to play Smolder and Umbral. We can just play our full like Starfall kind of build anyway, right? I don't think we necessarily have to do these builds. But yeah, we'll see. We're gonna see or look at the difference in a second. Yeah, Smolder also procs Waning, but you have to crit the Starfire. Like, it's not a given that you're just gonna get an Astral Smolder proc. Is what I mean, right? Because if you have mushrooms, you guarantee to apply Waning. If you don't have mushrooms, you can apply Waning with Smolder, of course, or with Stellar Flare, but it takes a while for that to happen. Or it doesn't happen at all, you know? Like, maybe you don't get a Starfire crit. Like, maybe it just doesn't get applied, who knows? Anyway, now we have this build here, which is... Now we're getting to builds that are quite a decent amount of damage loss, from 430k DPS to 414k DPS. And you're still running Astral Smolder and Umbral Intensity here, actually. Oh, this one has Rattle. Ah, okay. So this one is running Power of Golden and Rattle, which I do think is probably going to be something you maybe run for Tyrannical. Because I assume for single target, this is going to be quite a lot better, right? Because if you look at these builds, for single target, this is going to be a bit meh, right? Because we're losing Starweaver or Rattle. We're losing Power of Goldrin. Two decently good things that we have for single target, right? Then we gain Smolder and Umbral Intensity, but those are not really the best thing for single target anyway. So, yeah, for single target, this is a bit... So if you run this here, it has Goldrin and Starweaver, Rattle. And then we do 414, which, yeah, it's a bigger damage loss for AoE, but it's not that it's horrible. Then this one... Oh, this is just a live server build in comparison. Let's see what this build is running. Okay, yeah, this is a pretty standard and plus build. This is a pretty standard and plus build. Some people don't have second point in Balance of All Things and rather do Denizens or Power of Goldrin. But otherwise, it's a standard and plus build. And you can see it is 402k DPS on 8 targets in comparison. So all of the things that we looked at before had more DPS than our current best, like, live build, right? Keep in mind, though, that the better builds all revolve more around Starfire, which realistically is harder to reproduce than our current live build. I think our current live build is much easier to reproduce in an actual, like, live scenario, while these PTR builds are not. And then there's one more PTR build, and this one involves Rattle and Mushrooms. So you're basically dropping Smolder for Mushrooms. I assume this is going to be the best single target build, and you're going to lose some Starfall damage. It's always simming Starweaver in these dungeon sims instead of Rattle. But it's interesting to see, though. Like, it's interesting to see that for like a dungeon sim, it's simming... It's not simming Umbral or Astral Smolder to be good. While on the pure Patchwork sim, it's definitely simming them to be really good, right? And then it's also simming Starweaver instead of Rattle. And it's simming Power of Golden to be better. It's simming Denizens. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to see to look at the difference between Dungeon Sim versus like an actual like AoE Patchwork sim. Then we have some Trinket sims. Let's look at that. Okay, Whispering Icon and Rage Feather. The usual. Shadow Gem being up there. And then pure AoE, we have the Thing Trinkets. Like we have it right now as well, right? Alright. Yeah, that all makes sense. I didn't look at 4 targets yet. Okay, so this is a live server sim for 4 targets. Look at the talents. Yeah, all makes sense. Yep. Then this is, in comparison, if you look at the damage, 216k live servers, 230k PTR. Now this simming Smolder, UI. No Mushrooms, no Rattle. So this is the highest damage build apparently for 4 targets sustained. Then this is the second highest for 2 targets sustained, and this one's dropping Smolder. 1 point of Smolder into Mushrooms and 1 point of Balance of All Things. So you're basically just gaining Mushrooms. This is already more realistic than this build, in my opinion. Having Mushrooms just makes sense, in my opinion. Then this one dropped a little bit more DPS, but not a lot, 4k, and it picked up Rattle. But it dropped Mushrooms again. So you're dropping Smolder completely, dropping 1 point of Balance of All Things, putting 2 in Goldrin and 1 in Rattle. And then this one has Mushrooms and Rattle and Goldrin, dropping both Astral Smolder and in Umbral Intensity. And then you also have to keep in mind that even the lowest damage build, like this one does the least amount of damage at 219k, right? But even that build does more damage than our live server build. It's only a small difference though. And I kind of feel like that this is going to be a much more realistic build for us, personally. Like, I personally think that, yeah, this whole Starfire hype that we're getting through these sims, like, I'm not sure if this is going to be really relevant. Like, I'm not sure if this is going to be realistic. Maybe it just depends on the dungeon, because Astral Smolder and Umbral Intensity and this whole, like, Starfire build, that seems to be really good next patch. Like, is it actually going to be good? Or is it just, like, good for simming? You know, like, I personally think that we're probably going to be running more of a build that is like this. Like, more of a build where we don't run Smolder or UI, and we'd rather just play Rattle, Goldrin, Mushrooms. Kind of the same build as we run now. The reason why I think that is because I don't think we're gonna sit there realistically and cast Starfires a lot. Like, we just have to move. There's thundering we have to clear. There's tornadoes you have to dodge. There's swirlies on the ground you have to dodge. There's things you have to line of sight. You have to go bear form. You have to do this, blah, 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 right? You constantly have to, like, interrupt your spells and move around. And if Starfire is gonna be your main damage dealing ability in M+, then you're gonna be losing so much damage from doing all of those things, right? So if your whole talent build is set up to buff your Starfire, I think you're just gonna be losing so much damage for playing the dungeon in, like, a realistic way. So I think it makes more sense to go with a build that sims less damage, but it's easier to hit those numbers, right? Like, if you run a build like this, it's much easier to hit 219 KDPS with this. Even though the other build sims higher, right? Like, this sims 230 KDPS, but is it going to be easy to hit 230 KDPS if most of the damage from this build comes from Starfire? I don't really think so. And then additionally, we're going to do less single target with this build. Like, this whole Smolder and UI thing is set up for, like, really big pulls when you need consistent AoE damage, especially when it's, like, lots of targets, right? And I think we're already good at that scenario anyway. So should we be dropping damage on other scenarios where we're not good at, just to gain damage in a situation where we're already good? And I don't think that's true. Like, I don't think that makes sense. So in my opinion, I think we're gonna be still running very similar builds to what we did before the patch, just because this whole Starfire focused build is not very realistic to do in an M+ scenario. And additionally, I also don't think that it makes sense for us to drop damage on single target and drop damage on, like, lower amounts of targets just to gain damage in big AoE scenarios where we already are good no matter what we do, right? Like, the difference between doing, like, 430k sustained or 415k sustained, like, you know what I mean? Like, I think we're going to be topping the damage meters no matter what we do on a sustained AoE fight. And yeah, is it good to do more sustained AoE? Yeah, of course. But is it worth it to drop a lot of your single target damage and lower target damage to do more? I think not. Especially because Mythic Plus consists of majority smaller pools. Like, if you look at all of the dungeons that we have in the current dungeon pool, the amount of huge pools that you're doing in M+ is very low. Like, there are some big pools, but they are not the majority of M+ in a percentage-wise. Like, I think percentage-wise, in a whole dungeon, you do, like, 50% of the time you probably do smaller pools or single target. Or maybe even more. Maybe it's more like 70%. 70% of the pool, you either kill a boss, you kill, like, 3 or 4 targets, you kill 2 targets, you do a bunch of targets but 1 priority target that you're focusing. And then maybe 5 to 10% of the pools are gonna be big AoE pools where you need consistent AoE damage, right? So completely changing your whole talent tree just to be better on those 10% pools, probably not worth it, right? So I personally think in a realistic scenario, we're going to be playing more of a build that is very similar to what we play right now. Continue to do what we're doing, just putting a bit more emphasis on Starfire. Because Starfire is going to be still good. Even if you drop Umbral, even if you don't play Smolder and Intensity, Starfire is still going to be a good spell, right? So I definitely think we're going to be putting more emphasis on Starfire no matter what. build we're running. But I just don't think that we should change our whole talent build to just be Starfire focused, right? But yeah, so in the end, looking at all of these numbers now, I think the conclusion is that damage-wise, I don't think very much is going to change realistically. Like, I think we're still going to be more of like bottom tier single target spec in raids. We're not going to get buffed on single target or whatever. We're still going to do kind of bottom tier damage in single targets in raids. In M+, we're still going to be very good on sustained AoE pulls, if not better than what we were before. And depending on which build you're running in M+, it might be a slight single target nerf for you on single target with the AoE and plus talents. So if you go for a full AoE damage build and a plus in the next patch, then you're gonna lose single target damage into like the comparison that we had before, right? But if you run more of the similar build that we did before, then you're probably not gonna lose much single target either. So yeah, that's my conclusion. I think the tree is good. You have options what you can do. You know, you can run more Starfire focused builds on AoE. You can not do that if you don't want to. You have the options of running mushrooms or not. You have the options of running Rattle or Starweaver or not running it, depending on what you want to do. For single target and for raiding, nothing much probably is going to change, I don't think. We're still going to be running very similar builds as we did before. Like, I think a build something like this is still something we're going to run in raiding too. On fights where you need a little bit of AoE and you want your dots to be extended and you want to apply waning. Like, maybe this is going to be a build for something like the Thea, maybe, I could imagine, where you would want to have the mushrooms. And maybe you want to have Ethereal Kindling as well. It's good that we have Solar Beam baseline now, unless you run a super fully focused single target build. We're never going to run Lunar Shrapnel anymore, because that talent is just horrible. It used to be horrible before. We were just forced to take it before. Not going to be running Denizens as much as we did before, like in M+. We're probably never going to run Friend of the Fae anymore, which... whatever. There's still some builds that run Denizens, like this build here, for example, is running Denizens, but not Friend of the Fae. The thing with this talent tree is that at the bottom, we don't have a lot of points, even though we want more, right? Like, I feel like in this area, there's definitely a lack of points in comparison to what we had before. There's just a lot of things that we would want, technically, right? So we have to drop some things that we were able to pick up before. It's not the end of the world, because a lot of these talents are not very good anyway, right? Like Friend of Fae is kind of meh, Mushrooms is meh, single target, Illumin's Guidance is meh, so like Radiant Moonlight is not something we ever skilled anyway, so it's like all of this stuff is like whatever. Now, one thing that I didn't mention yet is that they did actually change Astral Communion to give us 20% more Astral Power. So instead of having 100 Astral Power, we have 120 if we go with Astral Communion. Now, none of these builds included Astral Communion because it's a damage loss to take it compared to having other talents in a simulation. Is it going to be a damage loss in an actual real scenario? I don't know. It might be possible that this is something that we run. I'm definitely going to have to test it to see if it's like a good thing, because having 20 more Astral Power is going to be nice, in my opinion, for certain like scenarios where you're basically running out of globals. I think the 20 extra Astral Power is going to help you so much when we're setting up a pool, whenever you feel overwhelmed and you want to do everything simultaneously, right? Like, you're going into a pool, you want to put your Moonfire, you want to put your Sunfire, you want to enter Eclipse, you want to cast Mushrooms, you want to cast Fear Balloon, you want to do all of these things. But we have to cast Starfalls in between because we are otherwise going to overcap Astral Power, and we don't want to do that, right? So having 20 extra Astral Power is like, maybe it's going to be nice for those situations where you would like overcap Astral Power, but you're like, oh, I have 20 more Astral Power, so I can finish my Mushroom cast before I start spamming Starfalls, you know what I mean? Well, in the past, maybe you felt like, oh, I have to cast Starfall now because otherwise I have an overcap, so I'm going to cast Mushrooms in the next global, right? But getting Mushrooms out is really good early on to get your waning up. So maybe having the extra 20 Astral Power is going to help a little bit for those pulls. And maybe it's going to be a damage gain in a realistic and plus scenario compared to picking something else up. I think the biggest problem with this Astral Communion pick is the fact that it's in the bottom side of the tree. Like, if Astral Communion was at the middle part of the tree, you would pick it up so much more. But the thing is, it's at the bottom part. And this bottom part here, there's so many points we want technically speaking. So wasting a point for Astral Communion to have 20 more astral power is a bit like, I don't think that really makes sense. If it was here, like somewhere here, it would be no problem to pick it up, I think. But yeah, down here is a bit, But anyway, so this is my opinion of the new patch. I don't think any of these builds are like set in stone or anything, so I don't necessarily want to link any builds anywhere, because these are just like preliminary sims that might not be like final at all. Maybe it's not realistic to do any of this. So you can of course copy the builds by like looking at them and like just trying them out. But I don't necessarily want to link any sims anywhere, and I also don't want to link any builds anywhere, because, you know, like maybe none of this makes sense. Take all of this with a grain of salt and maybe look back, or try. You're definitely welcome, because obviously the patch comes out or is out already when people watch this on YouTube. But yeah, look at, like, try out these different builds and play around with them. And once we have like actual builds, like real builds that we know are good, then you can check back in on my stream, or it's going to be in the Dream Grove Discord channel as well. I'm sure they're gonna have lots of stuff there. So the class tree, on the other hand, I didn't really talk about the class tree, but the class tree is almost all just utility anyway. The only thing that we still want to pick up Likara's teachings, of course. We still want to pick up Astral Influence, because we need improved Sunfire. Like, you have to pick it up to get here. You of course want to pick up Moonkin Form and Sunfire, it makes sense. And other than that, you can do whatever you want. You can go down here and go damage taken reduced. You can go down here for Inca Roar. You can go there for Vigil, Heart of the Wild, you know, like, you have options. Just do whatever you want. You can even go down here to pick up increased movement speed, which is something that I might do in M+, actually. I haven't thought about it yet. Depends on the dungeon I do. But yeah, picking up Feline Swiftness is not going to be a horrible thing anymore. And it's still pretty horrible, because you have to waste a point in Thrash and Rip, and then like pick up the Feline Swiftness. But it's not as bad as it was before, so you have the ability to do that if you want. And you can also get Tireless Pursuit as well if you want, technically. So yeah, this is it.